I'm Dwayne Schultes, and today on this Vital Health podcast, I'm joined by three of my fellow panelists at the Bio International Convention in Boston. We're going to be discussing the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act on physicians and patients. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Barbara L. McAneny, the former president of the AMA and CEO of New Mexico Oncology Hematology Consultants Limited. Barbara, how are you doing? Thanks for joining us.
I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me.
We're also joined by Rafael Fonseca, the Chief Innovation Officer at the Mayo Clinic in Arizona. Rafael, thanks for joining us, sir.
Dwayne, it's my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
And I'm also joined by Steve Potts, who, we've been joined at the hip the last couple of weeks. Steve, it's great to see you, my friend.
You too.
We recently published at Vital Transformation a study called the Inflation Reduction Act's Impact on Early-Stage Venture Capital Investments. We've found enormous negative impacts for the Medicare age population due to the IRA, particularly in small molecules. Barbara, I'm going to start with you. You're a clinical trialist. We're seeing venture capitalists and angels in some of these early-stage clinical trials pull back in the data. Are you seeing this on the ground in your practice?
We are finding that the trials we are offered are less small molecules and more things like radiopharmaceuticals or theranostics or immunotherapy attached to various compounds. We are not seeing as much of third, fourth, fifth indication for a drug.
You run a series of cancer centers. Is this impacting your ability to deliver care?
Well, I'm co-chair of OnCare Alliance, which is a group of 32 independent oncology practices coast to coast, and we all do clinical trials ranging from phase 1 to phase 3. And what we're seeing is that there are fewer opportunities to take an orphan drug and add a new indication, which means when we know that it's working for that, we can use it off-label, but insurance companies try to deny it when it's off-label. We have to get the information we can gather for them. It's much easier to get these drugs to patients if there is a randomized controlled trial we can quote instead of just case reports.
Rafael, picking up on what Barbara just said, you're an independent oncologist, but you're not working in a small institution. Generally, you've been working at places like the Mayo Clinic. How is this impacting what you're seeing on the ground?
The net effects of what will occur with full implementation of IRA will take some years before they realize. And the effects that I see that are immediate are the same as were just described with regards to the clinical trials. Our interactions with the larger companies, they already have had a pipeline, and they're starting to rethink what may be secondary clinical trials that may lead to expanded uses of the drugs. And as Dr. McAneny was saying, if you don't have those indications, it becomes problematic. So then we have to be doing the peer-to-peer and those things. The net impact that I see that is greater right now is in our conversations with early developers and biotech, because everyone is saying, hey, is there something we can do to make this a biologic, or can we do this in such a way that it's not going to fall under the small molecule restrictions that we have? So artificially it changes the conversation, and it involves a new level of practicality that may, in a not good way, sometimes deviate from the scientific directory, which is just get the best product available for patients.
Just to be clear, you're saying that people are coming to you and specifically trying to swap out a modality from small to large.
Yes.
Is this happening fairly late in the game? Are we talking phase 3, phase 2, or is this safety?
No, this is pretty early. The people that already have the pipeline and have had the phase 1 and phase 2, for them it's more the hesitation. Does it make sense to keep pursuing something if I'm not going to have that time, right? If you have a molecule. But the main conversations are at the very early stage in both preclinical and phase 1, where biotech is rethinking what they should do, because they have to look at the whole calculation, and they have their investors, and they have to look at the net present value. And with all of that in mind, sometimes it doesn't make sense for them to move forward.
So, Steve, obviously this is your wheelhouse now. You are a biotech entrepreneur. You've done this for real and very successfully many times. How are you dealing with this modality issue? Are you changing the way you're looking at small and large molecules when you're approaching clinical research now?
The early stage was kind of the canary in the coal mine on IRA. We saw it immediately 3 years ago. I mean, I couldn't get a company funded small molecule-wise that would have gotten funded prior to the IRA. And this stuff is hard. I mean, I've been doing this 25 years. I've been involved in 2 drugs that were approved and a whole ton of things that don't work out. That is drug development. And so we do not need the headwind that we have. The bicycling was hard enough before that. The tragedy here from a patient standpoint is that you just don't know in oncology where the best drug is going to help the most patients. Right when we're at the peak of like our coolest stuff with precision medicine of trying to get fingerprints of what kinds of cancers might be helped by what kinds of mechanisms, and we come out with these molecules, all of a sudden we get this just massive headwind. It's not interesting economically. I mean, you just can't get it funded. So you just see whole patient populations that are not going to get the opportunity to see if the drug is going to work there. And take multiple myeloma first. And you think of all the progress there and then say, okay, if the IRA small molecule penalty had been in place when you started your career, Dr. Fonseca, how interesting would have been the myeloma space with its 25,000 patients per year? What would have happened? And they're mostly elderly too. So what would that have looked like?
That's a very quick and simple answer. We wouldn't be where we are. And there has been so much progress that has occurred over the last 25 years. Some background, when I first started, the median survival for patients barely exceeded 2 years. Nowadays, it exceeds 15 years for most patients. And in fact, I believe there's a significant fraction of patients, still a minority, but a significant fraction, that are being cured from their disease. Now, how did this all get started? With small molecules. Small molecules like thalidomide and its derivatives, lenalidomide and pomalidomide, led to a boom in the development of compounds for the treatment of myeloma. And this was almost in parallel with the development of proteasome inhibitors, which are also small molecules. Now, because of these two developments, we could add them to steroids, which of course we've had for many years. But this just generated such interest in myeloma that the consequence that a lot of people paid attention to that. And we know that drug development is a multifaceted, multidisciplinary, complex process, right? So as you have people that are seeing that there's a path for success in myeloma, that got a lot of attention. And that led to the subsequent development of things like monoclonal antibodies. And nowadays, we're even using CAR-Ts and bispecifics. But it is without a doubt that we wouldn't have those treatments if we didn't have those first steps that were truly revolutionary in our ability to treat the disease with those small molecules. So it all is a concatenation. It all builds on previous success. But that's what it took to get us to where we are today.
That's a really good point, Rafael. And Barbara, coming back to you, this issue of the orphanization problem, where now we're moving away from that. If you think about lymphoma and the success of rituximab, which is now essentially borderline free, it's generic, the reality is you're not going to want to compete with rituximab. You're going to want to look at that population that isn't responding. What's going to happen if we can't deal with that clinically? What happens to your patients? What are you going to do?
It puts physicians in practice in really an untenable position that we should never be put in. And I think this will start in 2026 when we start to see the oral impact of the first 10 drugs. And then by 2028, when it kicks in the Part B infusible drugs, I think that will have a huge and negative impact. So let me explain what I mean by that. As certain orals become impossible to purchase and to provide through our in-house pharmacies, and most oncology practices prefer to have in-house pharmacies because often these drugs are used in combination with other therapies, and when you have to send them off to the pharmacy benefit managers and you don't know when they're going to actually get their orals, trying to treat patients is very difficult. And we pay 2 people in my own office just to call people up and say, has the PBM sent your drug yet? And then 2 days later, they call them again. Do you have your drug yet? And the answer is often no, and it takes a couple weeks, which is not good care. The second thing we find is that if we are allowed to prescribe and bill and collect for certain of the drugs on the list, we may find that we are subsidizing Medicare as an independent practice. If I have to buy the apple at $5 and sell it for $4, I'm not going to be able to continue to buy those apples. So the same thing may be true for some of our very effective drugs for the orals. When it gets to the intravenous drugs in 2028, that will put oncologists in the position of trying to decide between the patient in front of me who needs this drug that I know if I purchase it at average sales price and I'm reimbursed at maximum fair price, then I will be out of business in about 6 months. So either I have to deny the patient in front of me the drug that's the best drug for them, or 6 months later I'm denying a lot of patients access to the clinic because if I can't make payroll, we're not going to be there anymore. So this is very, very serious to us. The OnCare Alliance group of practices, we are often in urban areas, but we often have the satellites or the small clinics in rural America, places where there is no way to get to an academic medical center or do any other tertiary center to get to those drugs. So if I'm in an urban area and I say, I can't afford to give you this drug, I can tell the patient, go try to get it at the local hospital, often the 340B hospital. If I can't, or they can't get in, which is the usual event, then we're stuck. That patient doesn't get the drug they need, or I give the patient that drug and put my practice out of business. That's a Sophie's choice that physicians should never have to make.
Rafael, are you seeing similar concerns being expressed?
Yes, we are. I'm going to second a very important point that Barbara made and then see why we don't see as much pushback yet from particularly academic centers. And that is individuals like Barbara that have to run their practice are attuned to the realities of the world and the economics of what it takes to provide cancer care. I would say that when you look at the medical literature, and there's individuals who, I'm going to say probably all very well-intentioned, wanting to change the format, sometimes thinking, oh, this is going to be a great step, don't realize how detrimental this will be to the provision of care for patients. Because if you don't have the direct expertise on what it takes to provide cancer care and what the economics are behind that, you won't realize how damaging some of this could be. Also, 2026 might be a significant time when we see those changes. And I do worry that beyond that, we'll see even more change because of the detriment of the enthusiasm behind the development of all those small molecules.
So, Steve, picking up on what we've been listening to about the incentives and the challenges, your preferred pathway as an oncology developer would have been to come in with an orphan, smaller indication, and then move up into larger indications, neoadjuvant, adjuvant.
Yeah.
Is that still tenable for you?
That is how the whole industry has been so innovative. Rafael painted a little picture of myeloma, but that's all looking at it in hindsight. And Barbara could paint the same thing in a whole lot of really, amazing areas and solid tumors where you would never have expected a drug to just work as well as it did. It's trial and error. That's what's so beautiful about oncology is you can do that. You look for where it's going to most respond, and then you start to learn from that. Oncology is built on that. Almost every drug you can look at that. There isn't one where you said we're going to go after every colorectal patient or every big tumor types. It's all built on that. It couldn't have been more destabilizing to kind of how we have done oncology drug development. But there's so many different areas here. I mean, Barbara should have an hour to really talk about how little the thought of how an oncologist really makes their living was even considered when the IRA was done. I mean, it's almost like no one told them.
We were told back in 2005 when I sat on the Practicing Physicians Advisory Council and Tom Scully was the CMS administrator. He said, don't worry that they don't pay you enough to have a patient in an exam room. Medicare doesn't cover the expense or a first hour infusion. You'll have a drug margin. With the Inflation Reduction Act, that drug margin is going to drop by what Avalier says could be 47.5% for an oncology practice. No business is going to survive a 47% drop in their top line revenue. And so if practices don't survive, then the infrastructure of delivery starts to move from the outside in and just disappear. Small areas, rural areas, inner city, underserved, and then small hospitals will figure out they're not making any money on these drugs. And why are they buying these expensive drugs? Why don't they focus on surgery or the emergency department or obstetrics? And then less and less access will occur. The 340B hospitals will be last, but they will be overwhelmed by the fact that no one else will be left standing. And academic institutions will discover that they're depleting their reserves simply for the operations of buying drugs. And that is a devastation to the entire ecosystem of cancer care delivery. And that keeps me up at night.
For the listener, to make this very personal, what will happen is everybody think about their loved one. Maybe it's an aunt, an uncle, a spouse, a kid that's going through cancer. It's amazing how much an oncologist actually does besides just prescribing the drug. I mean, you're answering the calls of I have a rash, I have an itch, I have 20 different side effects I have to manage. Is the tumor growing? Is it shrinking? nutrition. I mean, there are so many things that you do besides just prescribing the drug. People don't realize that and how much value they're getting from that work of the oncologist for a small fraction that is basically paid out of the drug price.
If patients are not able to get the care to manage the drugs once they're given,
Exactly.
then they go to the emergency department.
Yeah.
And the emergency departments are already overwhelmed all across the country with stories of 12 and 18-hour waits. And people who are having an acute MI won't get in because the cancer patients are clogging the ER because they're getting sicker because they're not getting treated. This will have ripple effects through the entire healthcare delivery system that were just not considered as this act was rolled out in a great hurry.
And Barbara, it's pernicious because it's not just the fact that the maximum fair price, the MFP, will crunch you down by 50, 60%, and we roughly agree with Avalier's number. It's also that it's going to disincentivize add-on and follow-on clinical research. You're going to be doing less clinical trials. You're going to be getting hit twice.
We were hoping at first that clinical trials would be able to replace some of the lost revenue from the drug margin. But hearing from Bio and from Steve and others and from pharma manufacturers that they don't intend to do third-line, fourth-line indications, that has been a lot of what the OnCare Alliance group of independent practice has been very good at enrolling people on trials for. So that revenue stream is gone. The only way we see survival is to have the maximum fair price not be added into average sales price, and to have doctors paid as they have been on average sales price, and then have a rebate delivered from the manufacturer to CMS, and leave the practices, the hospitals, the delivery system out of the middle of this.
So essentially calculate the ASP, the 6% stocking fee, as it were, handling fee, have that based on the price before the maximum fair price, and then have that X MFP. So essentially you're getting what you were getting before.
Ideally, and not have us have to petition each individual manufacturer, because the administrative nightmare of having to figure out what does this manufacturer want that this other one wants, that a third one wants, and waiting months for us to be able to get paid with those rebates. We cannot afford that cash flow. These are practices with no reserves, mostly. They don't have the money to bankroll the system.
Rafael, obviously, Barbara's at an independent series of oncology units and oncology centers. You've been working for larger centers. Does this still impact you? I would think it would. And you can't cut clinical research in oncology by half and not expect an impact.
Oh, it impacts everyone. And the consequences create ripples that touch every single aspect of medicine. I think, as Barbara was saying, of course, the oncology practice has depended more on those margins. The revenue for the visits is nothing. The same is true for the holistic view of the finances of any hospital. There are parts of medicine that don't generate revenue, but they're critical for the development of transplant programs and cardiovascular programs and the like. And as you see the aggregate of what's happening, the hospitals are going to have to make up for this one way or another. And ultimately, there would be sacrifices, and unfortunately, the ones who pay the most are going to be patients. We're going to be limited in the access, not only at the site, but as was mentioned, by this implosion towards the larger centers. We must recognize there's such a large population that depends on rural hospitals and practices that are not affiliated with these hospitals that will not survive a significant change in the economics of their practice. So yes, the short answer is we see this too, but my worry is not that we're not seeing right now what it could be the worst, but if things play out, they're going to be obviously worse down the future.
So Steve, when you're choosing your clinical trial portfolio and where you want to go and who you want to work with, how are you changing your decisions now based on what's going on with IRA? How are you managing your clinical research?
The government is deciding which patients we want to go after.
Wow.
And also which modalities to use.
Just because of the disincentives?
Let that sink in a little bit.
Wow.
And then think about how much, just as one example, we always are fighting brain metastases, not to mention primary brain tumors, but brain metastases is a huge part of what you don't want to have with a cancer patient. And what modality do you think is best for a crossing a blood-brain barrier? It's a small molecule.
Of course.
And even if you get a great biologic, and that biologic could be a bispecific, it could be a antibody drug conjugate, it typically doesn't access the brain very well. So what do? You get a little nice park for the cancer to go grow, and then you don't have a small molecule to go after that. Bottom line, we're making decisions based on the government. Right when we have just so much interesting promise, and it's the small molecule and then it's the elderly, it's a double hit. The heme oncology area is so much elderly driven, and all the amazing progress has been done in that area that Rafael touched from. That's very much, these are diseases of the elderly, which is exactly what's being hit.
Rheumatology as well.
Rheumatology, yeah, absolutely.
Dwayne, let me give you an example. So I can think of 25 different compounds, and I can think of at least 8 lines of therapy for someone that I think I'm excited about what I can give because I know this works, right? And that's what we have seen in the field of myeloma. Let's say there was an event somehow that prohibited any more drug development today. There was this nefarious magic wand that stopped the whole thing. I might say, well, in myeloma, I made a lot of progress. We didn't reach the summit of Mount Everest because ideally we want a 5-day treatment that cures everyone. But we were getting very close. We were doing a lot of progress. Now contrast that to someone who would be diagnosed with, say, pancreatic cancer. And while there has been tremendous progress in pancreatic cancer, just this morning I was helping with someone who was looking for a second opinion, and I heard in the recommendations that were being made that there's things like capecitabine and then maybe there's gemcitabine, which they play a role. But these drugs are 30 years old plus at the moment. And if that stays, that's the current state of the best possible and never changes forward, it's going to be a shame, because anyone who attended the recent American Society of Clinical Oncology knows that slowly, and not at the pace that we want, but cancer is losing. We're making significant progress against many cancers. Not enough, not fast enough, but it will stop if we don't keep going.
And the KRAS drugs, which are the most exciting thing in the pancreatic field, these molecular glues, that is all small molecules. None of that would have even close to getting started if we had the pill penalty in place previously.
Let's look at next-gen treatments. Let's look at affibodies, the next generation 1/20th the size of monoclonal antibodies that can penetrate layers. Now, do those get labeled as biologics or small molecules? And then a capricious decision like that can fundamentally change all of the development we're going to have.
Just when we're at the most exciting, the most tools, the coolest things to attack cancer, we get the biggest headwind you probably could have invented. But drugs are only costing 8 or 9% of the total healthcare budget. So basically, if we could decide tomorrow to just give all drugs for free, and guess what? We would still get an A- in American expensive healthcare. We'd still have 91% of those costs.
There's another question, and this is something I'd just like to dig into a little bit. We're seeing insurers on the back of the Inflation Reduction Act starting to vertically integrate and acquire their own drug production. We're certainly seeing this with biosimilars. You have a situation where Blue Cross have bought into the former Sandoz and are now producing their own versions of Humira. We're starting to see them vertically integrate into channels and starting to acquire their own products, which they are then putting onto their own formularies and pushing other stuff off. What's going to happen if the insurers are going to say the drug you want is now going to be 4th tier? Is this a concern for you? Barbara, I'll start with you. You're shaking your head.
Absolutely. You're painting a terrifying picture. We're already seeing this with some of the payers developing their own pathways and putting the most profitable drugs for them on the top of their pathway, the one they have the best rebate from, et cetera, and not letting us choose the one that's best for the patient in front of us. And that is so frustrating to physicians. That contributes to burnout, and it contributes to suboptimal care, because when physicians give up and say, okay, this is what your insurance company will pay for, so I guess this is what you're stuck with, that's inferior care for patients, and it's just wrong.
Rafael, from your perspective, are you seeing a similar situation where insurers are starting to dictate policies based on products they're starting to own? Is this starting to occur?
It has occurred for some time already. I wouldn't even say it started to occur, but it has occurred, but it only gets worse. And there's many aspects that are a little bit nuanced that most of the people won't think about. One of my favorite topics amongst this is the step therapy, right? So we're going to have payers say, yes, we can cover this, but it's important that you try this first. And when you say that, There's potential benefit, of course, it can work, but there's a potential for the patient progressing or having undue toxicity or losing the opportunity of a very timely intervention. And ultimately, there's a factor there of attrition by people just giving up. Because now you've tried this, you're tired, you're not necessarily ready to get the next therapy, which should have been the very first one. We see the same with reimbursement, as was mentioned by Barbara. I mean, one of the less talked about aspects of what it means for patients to get these drugs is what happens with the middleman. And I think that's an area where there's a significant opportunity for reform.
I'm not a professional policy person. I wouldn't even be on this call if the IRA hadn't been so disruptive to what we were trying to do, which was develop small molecules. And believe me, I won't be doing any more policy once we get this fixed. So I'll just make my very dumb observation of this vertical integration thing. And I think you can see somebody developing generic biologics with healthcare providers. It would look a lot like what we've seen with the PBMs and the insurers lineup, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think what happened is someone said, look, the insurance, they want to control how much profit they were making, which was a good idea. And then instead, these PBMs grew kind of limitless in terms of how much profit they could make. And then guess what? Every PBM happens to own one insurance company. So beautiful idea. They figured it out, PBM insurance. Now it's like 2.0 of that. It's going to be insurance plus biologics provision. It sounds like a bad idea to me.
Well, not only that, they're starting to buy practices.
Right. The vertical integration has been shown in multiple studies that all it does is decrease choice and increase cost, and often decreases quality of care. If we truly just wanted to save money through the Inflation Reduction Act, why didn't we just eliminate the ability of the PBMs to add 50% of the cost of every drug that goes into their pocket? If we cut them out of the middle, prices would drop significantly, and Americans would have been thrilled. Their drug prices dropped, and we would not have bothered with interfering with the pipeline, interfering with innovation, interfering with practices being unable to continue delivering cancer care across the country. They missed a huge opportunity there.
And if you think about it, of the overall healthcare spent, 8 or 9% is drugs. And then of that amount spent, 50% of that is in this magical PBM box that nobody seems to be able to look into. And you look at Barbara, what is she spending? 3 or 4% of the drug price is going to all the work an oncologist has to do to give the drug, answer the calls at night, nutritionists, all the different programs that any of us that have had patients with cancer know. It's 24/7 figuring out all the side effects.
Yeah.
And then as a drug developer, I have to have investors think 10 years out, a stable environment, do all this work. The drug developer revenue net has been flat for a long time. Dwayne, you have those figures exactly, but the net prices have been flat for multiple years. It's the gross, that 50% that's going to the PBMs versus Barbara's few percent going to the actual oncologist delivering the care. Absolutely, there's places to cut here, but why is not PBM just front and center in that discussion? I have no idea.
It's because a lot of those rebates go to hold down premiums, and politicians are terrified for premium increases. That's it. And there's no transparency in the system. It's a black box.
So it occurs to me, Dwayne, that if the PBM goes to the manufacturer and says, I want you to increase your list price by $1,000 and then give me a rebate for $1,000, the patient is paying the copay on the higher amount. They often go to their insurance company they own and said, guess what? We worked so hard. You have a $500 rebate, and the other $500 goes in their pocket. And then the insurance company can go to the employer and say, oh, those terrible manufacturers, they've raised their rates. We have to raise your premiums. We have not seen premiums drop ever since PBMs were implemented. And the insurance companies get their 15%. 15% of a bigger number is a bigger number. And the employer and the patient, and to some degree, the practices are left holding the bag.
What was happening in Medicare before the benefit redesign wasn't actually the company that was paying it. It was actually Medicare. So it was the taxpayer. So you had this sort of false subsidy when it went to catastrophic. And all of that changed in 2025 with benefit redesign, and now the insurers are on the hook for 60%. And what do you see? You saw a $21 billion hole that was completely predictable and modelable if you knew the rebates, which we did and we presented. And what's going to happen is those will eventually have to pass through. Now, this is the question. Should premiums go up for transparency? Because right now everything is bizarrely convoluted and everyone's acting in a perverse way, but the incentives are perverse and they're acting logical. So we've created a perversely logical system, I guess. And the question is, what do we want to do about it?
Dwayne, I think a lot of this is driven by public opinion, right?
Of
and
course.
It's so critically important that we drive this into two buckets. One is the bucket is what do we spend as a system in drugs and what can be done for that? And the numbers don't lie. The number seems to be really fixed at it's 9 to 10% and not changing much. Now, there's a lot of things that can be done to improve upon that, but the net per capita expenditure in medications has not been skyrocketing, as is often said in news bits. And in fact, it really makes me angry when I see people like showcasing the equivalent of a Bentley and saying, well, these drugs are unaffordable. It's like saying the cars are unaffordable because this is a new Bentley, right? And there's all the cost that goes into that. So that's the one bucket. The other bucket, and I'm going to say something positive about the IRA, is actually the affordability, and that is how much patients have to have out of pocket. And that's probably the one part that gets closer to everyone and gets closer to our heart. I think that should be an area of great focus. Now, the IRA, a positive step was limiting the copays that patients would have to pocket out. Now, I would say we can go even further. There's studies that suggest that if you actually eliminated out-of-pay costs, the premiums would increase about 2%. The reality is that's what insurance is for. So we dilute the cost across everyone because those copays are particularly harder for those of lesser income, those on fixed income and seniors. If someone has a higher income, and monthly revenue, they're going to deal with that. But the patient that has that fixed income can't. And as has been said before, and as an important point by Peter Kolchinsky, no one wants to go on a joyride of cancer oral medications. Why would you take them? It's not like there's some hedonistic purpose for that. You endure them because they have side effects. They're very effective. They can be life-saving, but everything comes with side effects. So I think if we separate it into those two buckets, the conversation will be cleaner.
I agree completely with Rafael on that point. Copays were invented to decrease the expenses from insurance companies. The literature has shown that copays dissuade as much bad care as they do good care. The idea was that the patients need to have skin in the game. Well, I would propose that all cancer patients have all their skin in the game.
Absolutely.
And that therefore it's pointless. And furthermore, it costs me more to collect the copay than the copay is worth. And so it really is just set up as a benefit to the insurance companies and to no one else. And there's no reason we should be tolerating that.
That's an amazing point. And if you then add co-insurance on top of that, I had a friend that went to the hospital for 2 nights, $30,000. We drove by the hospital. He just pointed out, oh yeah, I was in the hospital for 2 days. He didn't say I was in the hospital and then start swearing and saying how much he had to pay in co-insurance because he didn't have to pay any of it. But this goes back to then the drug companies are the bad guys because it's easy to point at, well, drug prices are high when patients are getting screwed with having to do co-insurance and high copays. Of course, you're going to point right at the 8% of the healthcare dollar that's going to drugs versus the 30% of the healthcare dollar that's going to hospitals or the additional 20% that goes to physician practices.
Yeah, but the problem is, as we've discussed, Steve, over drinks a couple times, UCLA Med Center is the single largest employer in the state of California after the U.S. Navy. And no politician wants to poke that bear, unfortunately.
That's what's tragic. And I tried to have this conversation when I was testifying in Congress, is that all of the people that are spending their lives in STEM, this is 100% STEM work. It's an amazing American enterprise. And we don't have a union. What's ironic, you have the most anti-pharma politicians. Some of them are amazing, but some of them are just shockingly anti-innovation in Massachusetts and in California. Rafael, we would never put up with that in Arizona, and I bet Barbara wouldn't in New Mexico. But it's amazing what you see there. But they don't connect the fact that you're killing STEM opportunities for their kids. That's basically, it's going to go to China. They couldn't do more to damage the opportunities that we've all had in basically STEM careers. They're not connecting the dots.
One final question for everyone. Rafael, you mentioned earlier your evil wand. Now, I'd like to flip that around and give you a Harry Potter wand and something that's actually positive here. And if you had that Harry Potter wand and you could make one change over the next 6 months regarding IRA and some of the other things, even maybe MFN or tariffs, whatever you want to talk about, if you could implement one change right now, NIH maybe, what would it be?
My one change would be that of limiting copay for patients, because then I would let the system play out. And I know we can look at the economics of that. There's multiple opportunities, but I would focus particularly on the middleman, and I would relieve patients that have 100% of their skin in the game, as Barbara said, from the onerous task of having to find those dollars to get their cancer medications.
Steve, you, same question. So you've got Rafael's magic happy wand now. What would you do if you've got something you could implement in 6 months?
We have learned absolutely that we cannot fund with a 9 years of return. It does not work. I wish it was 15, but 13, I think if we could move the 9 years to 13 and fix the small molecule penalty, it would help. The magic wand is not actually a change. It's a change to awareness. I wish that in every American family room, they would realize that the IRA did fix something that needed to be fixed, which is that there were drugs, biologics, that were not going generic in time. I wish it was 15, but 13 years has fixed that. There's only so much money that's going to go to drugs, 8-9%, it's pretty static. And when that goes to a drug that has had way too long of a patent, various things, that's money that's not going to the brand new cancer drugs.
Barbara, last word to you. What would you like to do if you could implement something with Rafael's magic wand right now?
So I would want to renegotiate the drug pricing process of the IRA, eliminate the way we are currently doing it, focus on having PBMs basically being replaced by a computer program that selects drug prices and gives it to everybody. And secondly, have the 340B discount follow the patient rather than going to institutions, so that every patient, regardless of where they seek care, can get drugs at a lower price, and eliminate copays and coinsurances completely for cancer drugs or anyone else with a life-saving necessity.
That's awesome, Barbara, and it sounds like very easy to do, and I'm looking forward to that implementation.
No problem.
Steve, Barbara, Rafael, thank you for your time, and it's been great speaking to you. The producer of the Vital Health Podcast is Dwayne Schultes. Our editor is Mark Brodeen. Our project manager is Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2025.